I didn't answer her at the party. The music was loud enough to blur conversations into a single warm noise. People kept handing me glasses I didn't want. My name was being said too often, stretched into congratulations that felt bigger than I knew how to hold. Somewhere between the cake and the photos, my aunt touched my elbow and guided me a few steps away, not far enough to be private, just enough to feel deliberate. She didn't look unkind. That's what stayed with me. Women don't last long in that field, she said almost gently, like she was offering something practical. There was no accusation in her voice, no challenge, just a quiet certainty. I remember nodding, not agreeing, just acknowledging that she had spoken. And then someone called my name again, and the moment dissolved before it could take a firmer shape. But it didn't leave, it settled somewhere in me, not sharp, not loud, just present. The first year after that felt like trying to tune into a frequency that kept slipping away. Meetings where I spoke and then listened as my idea came back 5 minutes later in someone else's voice, slightly reworded, more accepted. Emails that started warm and ended in correction. Small, consistent recalibrations of where I stood in the room. No one said I didn't belong. That wasn't how it worked. It was more like I had to keep proving the same point from the beginning over and over, while others seemed to move forward from wherever they had last been understood. There were evenings when I would sit in my apartment, laptop still open, reading my own work as if I could find the flaw they must be seeing, the sentence that wasn't strong enough, the calculation that didn't hold, something subtle but undeniable. And sometimes, without meaning to, I would hear her voice again, not the words exactly, but the shape of them. A quiet prediction, not cruel, just confident. I almost left once, not in a dramatic way. There was no resignation letter drafted, no final conversation imagined. It was quieter than that. I started browsing roles adjacent to mine. Positions that used the same skills but asked for less visibility, less friction. Work where outcomes were measured but not questioned in the same way. It felt like adjusting the weight of something I'd been carrying slightly off center. I told myself it was practical, sustainable, but every time I got close to applying, something stalled. Not ambition, exactly. More like a discomfort I couldn't justify, as if I would be answering a question I hadn't fully understood yet. The shift didn't come from a big moment. It came from a person who never made it feel like a shift at all. He was a senior engineer who joined one of our projects midway through. Older, quieter, not particularly interested in managing people or being visible in meetings. The kind of presence that didn't compete for attention. The first time I presented an idea in front of him, I braced for the usual pattern. The pause, the reinterpretation, the subtle redirection. Instead, he just nodded. Yeah, he said, that works. And then he built on it, not over it, not around it, with it. It shouldn't have mattered as much as it did, but it did, because there was no emphasis in it, no sense that he was doing me a favor. My competence wasn't surprising to him. It didn't require acknowledgement. It just was. That recalibrated something quietly, not my confidence exactly, more like my expectation of what normal could feel like. Time passed in ways that didn't seem important at the time. Projects that came and went, some that stalled, some that succeeded without much recognition, late nights that felt routine instead of meaningful, mornings where I had to convince myself to start again, not because I was failing, but because nothing about it felt like a breakthrough. But something was building, not in a way I could point to, more like a slow accumulation of decisions that stopped orbiting around other people's perceptions. I stopped anticipating dismissal before it happened, stopped editing myself in advance of being corrected. Not entirely, but enough that I could hear my own thinking more clearly. At some point, I realized I hadn't thought about my aunt's comment in weeks. And when it did come back, it felt smaller. Not disproven, just less relevant. The project that changed things didn't announce itself as important. It was introduced in a meeting with more hesitation than excitement. A bridge, functional, necessary, but complicated by constraints that made it less appealing. Budget limitations, structural challenges, a timeline that no one seemed comfortable committing to. People spoke about it like it was something to be managed, not owned. There was a pause after the overview. Not long, but noticeable. I heard myself say I would take it. No one reacted strongly. A few nods. A couple of follow-up questions. It didn't feel like a declaration. Just a decision that needed to be made by someone. Afterward, I wondered if I had misunderstood the room, if I had stepped into something others had avoided for reasons I hadn't fully grasped. But there was no easy way to step back, and I didn't try. It wasn't smooth. There were weeks where the calculations didn't align the way they were supposed to, where small errors had larger implications, where I had to go back, adjust, rework without the comfort of certainty. There were meetings where I had to hold my ground, not aggressively, but firmly enough that the project didn't get reshaped into something safer, less effective. Responsibility settled differently when it was yours in a visible way. It didn't allow for deflection, but it also didn't leave room for hesitation. I wasn't perfect in it. There were decisions I second-guessed. Conversations I replayed later, thinking of clearer ways I could have explained something. Still, the work moved forward. Not quickly, not dramatically, But consistently, by the time it was done, the feeling wasn't what I had imagined success would be. There was no surge of validation, no moment where everything aligned into a clear sense of arrival. If anything, it felt quiet, because the version of me who had needed that kind of confirmation had changed somewhere along the way. The bridge existed, that was enough. The unveiling was more formal than I expected. There were officials, a small stage, a series of speeches that moved between technical acknowledgement and public gratitude. My name was mentioned in ways that felt slightly detached from how I experienced the work itself. I stood where I was directed, listened when I was expected to, nodded at the right moments. It was structured, controlled, clear, and in that structure, something shifted in a way that couldn't be interpreted differently, not internally. Externally, authority had recognized the work publicly, without qualification. I didn't know my aunt would be there. I saw her before she saw me, standing a little apart from the main group, looking toward the bridge the way most people were, curious, assessing, present without being central. For a moment, I considered avoiding her. It would have been easy. The crowd was large enough, but something in me resisted that, not out of confrontation, but out of a quiet sense that avoidance would give the past more weight than it deserved. So I walked over. She turned as I approached, her expression shifting from mild distraction to recognition. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just unfilled. "You built this?" she asked. It wasn't disbelief, more like recalibration. I nodded. "Yes." She looked back at the bridge, then at me again. There were a few possible directions the moment could have taken, questions, explanations, even a soft attempt to revisit what she had said years ago. But none of them happened. She just nodded once, slower than before. "That's good," she said. And that was it. No apology, no acknowledgement of the past. No need for either in that moment, because the sentence she had given me years ago didn't fit anymore. Not here. Not in a space where the outcome stood in front of both of us, unchanged by interpretation. Later, after the crowd had thinned and the formalities had ended, I walked part of the bridge alone. Not the full length, just enough to feel its scale in a way that wasn't defined by speeches or expectations. People were already using it, walking, crossing, moving forward without thinking about who had built it or why. 15,000 people would cross it every day, they had said, a number large enough to matter, small enough to feel real. I paused near the center, looking out at the structure not as a symbol, but as something that simply existed now. The silence I had chosen years ago came back to me then, not as something I regretted, but as the beginning of an answer I hadn't needed to rush. I turned and kept walking,